Hi, friends! I wish you all a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. I hope you guys are having a great time. Today, we're doing something I've wanted to do for quite a while. We're ranking all of the internationals. Now, let me be very clear here. This is purely a subjective, personal ranking. This is just based on how much I like all of the internationals. This is just my own personal tier list. Now, let me also say one additional thing. All of the internationals are great esports tournaments. So we are ranking them right now based on how much I like them, but I actually like all of them. I think they're all great. And I want to make that very clear. We are comparing TI to TI today. And as a result, one TI is going to be at the bottom and one TI is going to be at the very top. So I'm going to have some controversial choices, but I promise I am 100% sincere about everything I say. And I'm not just, making picks to get people angry, so keep that in mind. But also, if we were comparing TIs to other esports events, then all of them would be ranked very highly. I want you to keep that in mind as well. Anyways, so this is why I call myself a TI expert. I think the title of this video is just very fun. I've always kind of wanted to make a video with a title like this. And I think currently I can still call myself a TI expert. Why is that? Well, I made Stories of Dota. Stories of Dota, of course, is a YouTube channel that analyzes the design and competitive history of Dota heroes. For that, I watched a lot of TI. And when I say I watched a lot of TI, I mean I watched probably more TI than anybody else on the planet. I have seen every single tournament likely around 15 to 20 times, and I have made a massive spreadsheet, which you can see a small snippet of down below, which is my collection of games that I've seen combined with a detailed breakdown and analysis of every single game. So I believe that this spreadsheet is the most comprehensive piece of Dota analysis, TI analysis that probably exists. At least from a historic perspective. And what you're seeing there is probably I would guess, maybe like an eighth of one tournament. And I've done that kind of thing for every single tournament. So yeah, I have watched a ton of TI. Not only have I watched all of the TIs recently, which is a big factor, but of course I have also seen them live. So I've played Dota 2 for over 17,000 hours. Well, not over, nearly 17,000 hours. And I've been playing Dota since the very beginning. I was at the first international. I was also at the International 6. So I've actually traveled and attended 2 internationals. And I've seen all of the other ones live. And I'm actually planning on continuing that trend. I want to watch future internationals as well. So what I'm saying is I think I know a lot about the internationals, but today is mostly just about telling you which of these tournaments I enjoyed watching while I was making Stories of Dota. Because for Stories of Dota, I have seen all of these tournaments so many times. And now I just feel obligated to tell you about which ones are good. So let's start. The international one is unfortunately at the very bottom. This is this one I don't feel very good about. Not because the international one deserves to be higher. It doesn't deserve to be higher. But that's because this is almost a prototype tournament. It's almost a beta international. Dota itself was actually in very much a closed alpha state during the time of this tournament. Many teams didn't even have time to practice within the actual client because they only got it so briefly before the tournament. And the tournament was run kind of first of all, there were a whole bunch of games that just didn't have any commentary. The games that did have commentary had a really shitty audio. Many games were plagued with disconnection issues and lag issues. And I think that these kind of technical issues led to a very kind of slow, passive meta. Because just imagine, you're playing at the first international for $1 million and the game is lagging. Are you going to be aggressive? No, right? You're going to be passive, you're going to farm up, and you're going to try to get into a game state where you can win while actually disconnected. So that's kind of the problem. The one team that actually played, really well was Navi, and the team that really knew what they were doing. They played really aggressively. We and Navi. And when Navi was playing, the game was, the games were actually kind of fun. Although I would still say that the meta game was just very slow. Part of that was also just because of a very small hero pool, because only 46 heroes were actually in the game, which of course is also a limitation of Dota being in this closed alpha state, and also items were missing, so heroes just didn't really have any mana. I think you can see that there were a multitude of issues that existed, which unfortunately just forces me to rank TI1 this low. I want to say that it deserves better, but if I say that, I don't mean that it deserves a higher ranking, but instead that I think I shouldn't be ranking it. It just feels a little bit unfair because this was before anything had been figured out, and the gap between TI1 and TI2 is so absurdly, ridiculously massive that I don't know. I just feel like I shouldn't be ranking it. But here we are. We gotta rank it, and so unfortunately it has to be at the very bottom. This brings us to our actual beginning of the list. This is the International 10, and yeah, I know there's going to be some of you that really like this tournament. Let me start out by saying that Team Spirit winning this tournament was very exciting. The Team Spirit storyline was great. Everything else about it, I think, was terrible. Okay, wait, I shouldn't use strong words like that. Again, all of the TIs are good. This too is a good esports event, but it is my least favorite TI from like an actual, I do not enjoy watching this tournament very much. And that's because of its terrible, terrible meta game. So leading into TI10 was of course the pandemic. And during the pandemic, the usually scheduled TI was cancelled, which means that before TI10, there was a 2-year gap as opposed to the usual 1-year gap. Now, this 2-year gap was also a bit unusual compared to the previous years because there was a lot of power creep that happened in there. There were Aghanim's shard was added, heroes were allowed to go to level 30, neutral items were added. So there were just like a whole bunch of things that made everybody a lot more powerful, and the game just kind of started revolving around these new elements and this like burst level of power creep. And the problem was that Dota itself just wasn't actually ready to handle that power creep. Dota itself was not in a state where heroes, where it could support heroes that were that powerful, because powerful heroes farm really quickly, right? And so the powerful heroes, they went to farm in the jungle, and then the jungle was farmed. They just wasn't really anything else to do in the jungle. So they okay, well, what do we do? Pushing, incredibly risky because of comeback mechanics in Dota, right? And because heroes were pretty rich, a lost fight would swing back a ton of gold. So that's difficult, right? So you can't really just force a push. That's not a great idea. So what do you do? How do you actually try to win? Well, Roshan at the time was worth a ton of gold. He had an Aghanim's shard that he dropped on his second death, that's just worth a lot of money. And then his third death was also worth a lot of money. So as a result, Roshan became the sole focal point of the tournament. And the metagame started revolving around killing Roshan early at around 15 minutes, 20 minutes, before 20 minutes usually. That's the first Roshan kill. Ideally as quickly as possible. And either team took that one. That one didn't really matter that much. But then starting from the second Roshan fight onwards, or Roshan kill onwards, teams would fight very, very heavily for Roshan. They would always try to contest the second Roshan and the third Roshan and so on. And in those Roshan fights, teams would go for Roshan, fight for Roshan, and then a team would win. That team would take Roshan, and then they would decide whether or not they won the fight enough to push. Very frequently, they didn't, and so they just went back to farm some more until the next Roshan. And the meta just kept going like this. Teams were just like, okay, well, let's go Roshan fight. Oh, we didn't get an advantage big enough to win? Well, I guess we go farm. Okay, let's Roshan fight. Oh, we didn't get an advantage big enough to win? All right, let's go farm. And the games didn't really win through, didn't get won through pushes, right? Like teams wouldn't win the game by, moving into the enemy base and pushing down the base. Instead, they would win by going for Roshan, winning a Roshan fight, and then just taking their entire army and just marching into the enemy base. Part of that was also because the Ancient at the time was really squishy. it also hadn't been updated to scale with the power creep of that era, which meant that teams could actually just win a Roshan fight, decidedly, walk into the enemy base, and just ignore barracks, ignore everything else that was there, and just kill the Ancient. Which meant that any failed fight anywhere on the map was so unbelievably risky that, again, teams just wouldn't want to take them. I think you can kind of see what I'm saying here, right? The game became this like cyclical game where everybody was just only doing Roshan. And I personally did not enjoy that. And I do not recommend this tournament for a rewatch. This is my actual least favorite tournament, and I don't think it's all that fun. It also didn't help that because of Corona, and well, actually, it's less because of Corona, more because Valve didn't do a great job preparing for Corona. This tournament had worse production than the years before it. So, anyways, next up, we've got the International 11. So the International 11 suffers from a similar problem. TI 11 had the Wraith Pact meta, right? So going into TI 11, Valve had nerfed Roshan, but they added a couple of new items to try and give heroes more things to do. And one of the items they added was Wraith Pact. And at first, Wraith Pact was terrible. It just wasn't really that good. And then pretty briefly, like pretty shortly before the tournament, Valve buffed Wraith Pact. And then it suddenly became absurdly powerful. It was so broken. And that kind of ruined the tournament. Like the entire tournament became about this one item in every single way. The tournament winners, Team Tundra, ultimately won because they were better at dealing with Wraith Pact. Not necessarily just using it themselves, but they were really good at dealing with it and playing around it. And I don't know, I always thought that was kind of silly. This tournament also had the problem of still having like no major adjustments to this post-power creep Dota. There still weren't enough objectives. And this time, Roshan was even nerfed. So there were significant stretches of games where both teams just kind of did nothing, which was really weird. Like teams just would kind of do nothing. I don't know. It was a really weird tournament. Couple that with the main bracket stomp from Team Tundra, and then also the I'm kind of like lacking stage of this tournament where it wasn't hosted in like a nice big fancy arena like the TIs usually are, and instead it was hosted in this kind of like convention hall, I think. It just didn't have the same level of flair. It didn't have the same level of ambition, I felt, and as a result, it just wasn't a tournament that I can recommend very highly. This era of TI 10, TI 11 is my least favorite era of Dota, and that's just because Valve had kind of overcommitted to power creep and didn't quite know how to handle it yet. They did eventually end up fixing this. But first, we go to my next controversial pick, the International Free. And I know this is gotta be insane. Baumi, what are you saying? International Free. Bottom 4. You gotta be joking. No, I'm not joking. So let me be very clear here. If this was a ranking of the internationals, of the tournaments by their most exciting games, by their grand finals, then the International Free would be the first placed tournament. It would be the number one tournament, the best tournament ever. I think it had the best finals we have ever seen, and it had a couple of the most exciting games we've ever seen. I mean, Fountain Hook was part of this tournament. So it's an incredible tournament in that regard. If you're looking at only the best games, the problem is that if we're looking at all of the other matches as well, it is terrible. And that's kind of the tricky part of the International Free, right? It's got incredible peaks, but most of it is just so unbelievably boring. And that's because Alliance, we're kind of like the trendsetters of this tournament. What Alliance would do is they would just kind of like outfarm you. They would just say, we're just going to go AFK for 50 minutes and outfarm you. And then other teams saw that and they were like, oh, cool, we can play like Alliance. The problem is that Alliance would do that. And then while they were doing that, they would backdoor push you. So even though Alliance were getting ready for a 50-minute game, it actually wasn't that unusual that they would end their matches pretty quickly. But the other teams that were imitating them, they would just farm for 50 minutes. And it wasn't unusual for games to have literally 5 kills 50 minutes into it. Sub 10 kills like an hour into it. The kill counter would only go up once you had like a big final fight where like one team would kill the other and then it just end the game. So a lot of the matches felt a little bit like a waste of time. Like it's just kind of like, why are we even here? Just so you guys can just like, I don't know, farm for like, just go AFK farming. Why do you even need an enemy team for this? It felt really, really weird. Yes, the International Free has some of the best games ever. And the storyline of Na'Vi working their way back to Alliance after dropping into the lower bracket in the upper bracket finals through Orange, who were also a fantastic tournament. Like that's so good. And then, Alliance being just such unbeatable kings, and Na'Vi shows up in the last moment and like shows, no, we can do this. And then almost managed to do it, and then you know how it went. You know how it went. But to me, it doesn't make up for the horrible, horrible games I had to endure while watching this tournament. I am sorry. I don't need to watch. This is a meta. This is a meta where offlaners just gave up. And what I mean with that is that a team would just straight up not send a hero into the offlane, and instead just stick him into the jungle. So they were there were mid laners who were fighting each other, and then there were 2 lanes that were not being contested, just straight up not contested, because the offlaner didn't feel like fighting into the offlane, or like into the tri lane, I suppose, right? And that's just like, I don't know. That doesn't really make for an exciting laning stage, does it? So that brings us to the International 13. Now, I want to make very clear, this may seem like we're still at the bottom of the ranking, but now we are getting into the tournaments that I think are just really cool. Like, I like the International 3 as well. Like, I want to make very clear that everything is really good. It's just, you gotta rank it somehow, and I unfortunately have to put the International 13 here. I think this was a great tournament. I actually really liked it. I think having the facets made for some really strange and exciting strategies, which I enjoyed. We also had a post power creep meta that actually worked because, we had the larger map at this point since TI 12. And overall, just a cool tournament. I liked it. But God, it wasn't balanced. That's the biggest problem with this tournament. The hero balance and the meta diversity was actually incredibly, incredibly low in a frustrating way. Like, I just kind of wish there had been more heroes that were picked. I think like 25 characters weren't chosen at all, which is super high, super, super high. And combine that with most of the main bracket just being stomps, I rank this tournament lowly, not because of any fault of Dota, I feel, more just because, I don't know, the competition didn't work out in the most exciting way, right? Like, that's just something that can happen in a tournament. Sometimes you have tournaments where, due to no fault of the game, it just ends up not being an exciting tournament. And this is kind of like not that really, but I just have to use some criteria to rank things lower. So the International 13 ended up here. That brings us to the International 4. Now, the International 4 in many ways is very much the opposite of the International 3. The International 4 has the world's worst finals. They're just terrible. These are not good finals. I'm not going to try to defend them. Now, personally, I think they are actually kind of interesting just because they're this weird stuff happening, but like, I get it. They are not exciting to watch. In case you don't know, the International 4 finals lasted a combined 80 minutes. Like, all 4 matches combined lasted 80 minutes because they were such brutal stomps. So that's a little bit shit. All right. I don't think anybody is trying to tell you otherwise there. What I will, however, say is that personally, I actually really enjoy the meta of the International Four, because the International Four was a tournament that had really strange, like, style diversity, where some teams were playing these hyper aggressive pushing strategies, others were playing towards the late game, and anything in between was possible as well. So there was a very diverse meta that was then evolving very, very quickly, because Newbie and Vici Gaming were applying a lot of pressure on the other teams by increasing their own game speed over and over and over again. So Newbie and Vici Gaming were just kind of like doing the death ball pushes. And that then put this burden onto the other team of like, figure out this puzzle, solve this issue. How do you deal with this? And some teams got reasonably close. Some teams won against it and some teams didn't. Some tried to imitate it and some didn't. So it was this really interesting tournament of an evolving meta that was evolving incredibly rapidly and in a very strong and distinct way. Like, we will oftentimes have evolving metas at TIs, but I don't think any meta ever evolved as much as the International Four did, which makes it an exciting tournament for me. Also, I like that this is kind of our final go at old Dota. This is maybe a bit of a nostalgia thing, but again, today we're just doing my opinion. And this is the conclusion of the first era of Dota. I group Dota into a couple of eras. So we have got the first era, which is TI 1 through 4, which is kind of like the beginning, very much old school Dota. I would even say this is Defense of the Ancients All-Stars, right? And then we've got 5 and 6, which is this transitionary era into 7.0, where Valve were kind of trying to figure out what exactly they wanted to do with Dota. Then we have what I like to call the Golden Age, which is 7, 8, 9, where Dota had really kind of found its groove, and they were like, Dota was just kind of in a really solid state. Then 10 and 11, Dota was going through this kind of like power creep phase and was again trying to find its footing. It was another transitionary period. And now we are in modern Dota, which is, everything past 12. And modern Dota kind of has found its footing again. So this is kind of like my general grouping of the eras of Dota. And the International Four just kind of concludes the first era in a way that I think is iconic. And I just like it for that. I know this is definitely going to be a tournament pick or like a ranking pick that some people disagree with, but I would genuinely recommend give the International Four a try. It has some really exciting matches. The tournament is so fast-paced. I like it. I like Deathball as an option. I think it's not a bad thing if it exists. That's not to say that the International Four was perfect in that way. There was definitely quite a lot of deathballing going on, but I still liked that it was a possibility. That brings us to the International 12. So the International 12, I actually thought was really, really cool. For a similar reason to the International 4, because the International 12 was a tournament that had kind of clashing styles going up against. TI12 was the first tournament after 7.33. 7.33, of course, being the big patch that introduced the larger map, the additional creep camps, the tormentors, the wisdom runes, right? Just like adding more stuff to do onto the Dota map for the new power-crept heroes. And within that new environment, teams found two distinct styles of play. The first one was to just farm. Teams would just say, okay, well, more creeps on the map means more things to farm. And so they started farming a lot, and that makes sense. But then there were some teams like Gaming Gladiators that noticed that if you tackle the objectives on the map in a very specific order, you can actually create a lot of momentum for very fast pushes. Specifically, if you go for, so you steal the early Wisdom rune, the minute 7 and minute 14 Wisdom runes, ideally you try to steal those. And then after that, you push down the bottom, assuming we're on the Radiant. So you push down the bottom tier 1, tier 2 towers. You go for Roshan. You take the Roshan kill. You cycle back to take the Tormentor. So you steal the opposing Tormentor with your newly acquired Aegis. And then also steal the Wisdom rune. And then that sequence gives you an enormous lead for a moment, which you can use to just break into the enemy base and take 1 or 2 lanes of barracks. And that, of course, then gives you an enormous amount of gold, and you can use that to finish the game. So that, I think, was really, really cool. I like that. I think it's cool that such a strategy existed. And I like that it was gaming gladiators that kind of like fought their way through the losers bracket with that style, matching up against so many teams that were trying to do the more traditional farming strat. Of course, it was ultimately won by Team Spirit, and Team Spirit played the more traditional style, although they would occasionally play the aggressive one as well. And Team Spirit, they were just perfect. They played so incredibly well, which I think is nice to see. I enjoy having kind of 2 styles of finals, I suppose. I think it's cool when a team shows dominance, but then it needs to be in an exciting way. So I didn't really like Tundra's win because they were dominant, but it felt almost disrespectful in a way, but not like in a nice way. More like, why aren't you killing these nerds already? Like, why aren't you just ending the game? But so that, anyways, point being, I don't mind that if a team is very dominant. And of course, then the other style that is great, or the other thing that can happen that is great, is the team just kind of like being, or like having really exciting back and forth finals where it's even. This wasn't that, but that doesn't mean it's bad. So anyways, the International 12 finals were overall pretty cool, just because I liked the final game. Now, in case you don't know, the International 12 was a bit weird because it had a balance patch right before it, which changed a bunch of heroes around. And then as a result of that balance patch, those heroes that were changed, a couple of them were unbelievably powerful during the actual tournament. And that resulted in a meta game that was, it was silly. I think there were like 5 or 6 heroes that had like a 60 or 70% win rate. Dazzle, Chaos Knight, Spirit Breaker, those kinds of characters. And then in the grand finals, in game 3, Gaming Gladiators just lets Team Spirit pick all of them. And Team Spirit were like, I guess? So they drafted the entire lineup with these overpowered heroes. And then almost lost because of it, because it was such a greedy lineup. But then ultimately they ended up pulling through because Team Spirit were just so freaking good. And also because Team Spirit managed to, last into the late game and get all of their characters online. I guess that still is them being really, really good. It was exciting. And also I like that, at this tournament we could finally actually see modern Dota in kind of like its not necessarily final state, but in its like appropriate state, I suppose. That brings us to the International 2. That was a pretty high ranking for the International 2. Let me kind of like start with a bit of a weird point. So the International 2 was really unbalanced. Like it's actually, I think it's either this one or 13 that were the most unbalanced tournaments. But they're both like way, way worse than any other tournament. The International 2 had 8 heroes that had a 90% or higher contest rate, which is incredibly high. Usually, a TI has 1 or 2 heroes with a 90% or higher contest rate, not 8. That's absurd. But the thing is that those 8 heroes were cool. Like that's a bit of a weird thing to say, right? But here, sometimes it's okay if a character gets picked a lot. If that character is just a lot of fun to watch, if that character is just really exciting, and among the heroes in the 90% contest rate for the International 2, you had Invoker, Rubik, Lycan, Nature's Prophet, Leshruck. These are just cool characters. I think Nakasiren was in there too. Wait, can I piece together the rest? Tidehunter was part of it? Who am I missing? Okay, I don't remember the last one. Anyway, Darkseer. That was the last one. There you go. I figured it out. Anyway, that's just an exciting cast of top characters because, first of all, they fight really distinctly from each other, but they also fight really well into each other, right? Nature's Prophet and Lycan were strong pushers, while Naga Siren was a strong counter pusher. Same for Darkseer. You had heroes like Rubik, who were there to actually just kind of like adjust to whatever the enemy team was doing, and Invoker, who was playing a weird supporting role. It was just neat. Even though it was unbalanced, the heroes that were strong were just good heroes to have at the top. And as a result, I think the tournament played out in a really exciting way. Not only that, but there was a huge amount of gameplay diversity within the metagame. So while the hero diversity may not have been high, the game plan, game structure diversity was. What I mean with that is today, most teams follow the same game structure. Most matches follow the same game structure. You have one hero on the mid, you have two heroes on the top, two heroes on the bottom. Each team plays with 3 cores. And then you just farm, and then sometimes you start taking tormentors and so on, and eventually you fight on the map, and then eventually you just kind of push down the base after you've got enough of a lead that you can go in the game. Back then, it wasn't really that obvious what a team was going to do. The amount of cores wasn't clear. Where heroes would go lane wasn't clear. And how teams would approach the mid to late game also varied a lot. For example, the clip we're watching right now is from a game that Navi played, where they used Juggernaut not as a late game carry, but as an early aggressive pusher that bought a Vanguard and leveled up the healing ward to enable his team to just break down buildings very, very quickly. Of course, Juggernaut doesn't have to do that. He was also played as a carry in some other matches. In the match that we're watching right here, there's an anti-mage, which is a hero that wants to go into late game. Same for the Morphling. You can see there are not that many kills in this particular game. The tournament was just open to a broad range of strategies. It wasn't limited to just a couple of specific ones. And I think that worked really, really well for it. The International 5. This is a tournament that I think is a very confused tournament. So first of all, this is after 6.82. 6.82 is the most important patch in Dota 2's history because it reworked how Dota 2 functioned. Before this point, the most money you could earn quickly was by killing towers. So killing towers provided your team with like 1,200 gold, something in that ballpark. It was worth a lot. Tower kills were worth a lot of money. And then 6.82, which was released after TI4, changed that around and shifted the value of towers out of towers and into hero kills instead. So now hero kills were what was actually worth a lot of money, while towers were kind of a bit mid. They were not as much of a priority anymore. This meant that nobody knew how to play Dota. This may seem like a weird conclusion, but you have to keep in mind that teams had just spent 4 years and who knows how many before that point back in Warcraft 3 playing, well, Dota with towers. Dota centered around defending pushes. And now Dota was all about fighting. Dota was all about farming. Dota was moving more towards its modern direction. Not quite as much as it is today, but still, towers just weren't as big of a factor anymore. And that then is interesting because how do you play in this new environment? Teams weren't used to not having like big bursts of gold. They were used to having these moments where a team could work towards and suddenly gain a spike of power. This is why teams started playing with what I like to call the jungle support role. So each team would have one hero dedicated to only jungling, which is weird, isn't it? Now you might say, okay, wait, what do you mean jungle support or only jungling? So just a jungler? No. So a jungle support was a hero that would go into the jungle and just stack. Their whole job was just to stack. They would stack and defend the stacks, and they might occasionally annoy the enemy mid laner or go for a gank, but primarily they were just there to stack. And that then meant that eventually your mid laner, which was a hero that had big AoEs, like, Lashok, Queen of Pain, Storm Spirit, or Shadow Fiend, you would then take your mid laner and farm those jungle stacks. And then you got your burst of gold. The jungle support was a role that really only existed prominently at this tournament, although it persisted for a couple of years, and it wasn't quite as common though as it was here. So there was just like kind of this quirkiness to this tournament where teams were clearly still figuring out what do you even do. This also manifested in a couple of other ways. For example, teams sometimes would go into the late game and there weren't enough late game items in Dota yet. Valve had only recently started adding new items with 6.84. So because there just weren't that many items in the game, what do you buy if it's late game? That's right. Dagon. Because Dagon costs nearly 8,000 gold. And Dagon is very gold inefficient, but it's still powerful. It's just like it's really inefficient. But if it's, 60 minutes into a match and hero kills are worth a ton of gold now, you're not going to run out of those kind of like bags of gold that towers represented on the map any longer. You're still going to continue getting a lot of money in the late game. What do you buy? Well, I guess you buy Dagon. It's the only thing that's really expensive enough. So that was a really funny little thing that started happening where teams just kind of started playing towards these weird strategies. And I think that was fun. It was good. That's why I have confused meta. This is good. This tournament also had some cool storylines. We had CDEC Gaming coming in for the wild card and then, eventually defeating Evil Geniuses in the upper bracket finals after first losing against them in the groups. And then you have the EG versus CDEC run back, which is incredible. You have got Sumail, this wunderkind that just kind of like appeared out of nowhere and suddenly became the best mid laner in the world. And then you have the whole tournament won by just incredible drafting where Evil Geniuses figured out that CDEC didn't know how to play Lashok, and Lashok was the best hero in the game, so CDEC were forced to use their own bans and picks on Lashok to make sure that Evil Geniuses couldn't get him, because Evil Geniuses just simply refused to ever ban Lashok in the grand finals. And then Techies. Evil Geniuses played Techies, and Techies was genuinely a really big factor in their tournament victory because that was one of the heroes that CDEC felt like they had to ban no matter what. So there were just some brilliant drafting decisions that happened in the finals that I think make this a very memorable tournament. That brings us to the International 6. So the International 6 is just very, very funny to me. So we've talked about how sometimes a team stomping can be good and sometimes it can be bad. In this particular case, it is good. So we have Wings Gaming win this tournament, right? Wings Gaming were our champions for the International 6. And Wings Gaming, we're just kind of trolling. I don't even know how else to describe it. They did not feel like they were taking the tournament seriously. They just kind of like showed up to the International 6 and cruised for a couple of rounds of amateur matchmaking where they were just playing as some puppies that they had grabbed off the streets. And then they ended up winning the whole thing, obviously. I mean, like, come on. Who else was going to stand a chance against them? It's crazy. Wings Gaming, we're just so unbelievably good that it was just fun. I don't know. It was bizarre. I like it. Then, of course, the actual story of the tournament, the main storyline of this tournament was Digital Chaos. And Digital Chaos were a team that nobody expected to do particularly well, and then they started just kind of tearing their way through the losers bracket in a way that I don't think anybody saw coming. And they did absolutely excellently in that regard. And I think there's just there was this energy in the room that has rarely been matched, where truly it felt like everybody was always on Digital Chaos's side. And the other thing that was cool about that was that Digital Chaos had their arch nemesis. And it wasn't Wings, because everybody knew Wings were winning. But it was Evil Geniuses, the other North American team. And then you had the North American finals, which was the lower bracket finals with DC going up against Evil Geniuses, which was one of the best tournament series of all time. Like, absolutely incredible. You should absolutely go and watch that if you haven't seen it recently. It's absurd. Absurd. TI6, wait. Oh, sorry, I've confused something a little bit. TI5 was not the Dagon meta. TI6 was the Dagon meta. My bad. TI6 was the Dagon meta. Now teams were better at it. Just take everything I said about Dagon earlier and apply it to here. The same thing is true here. I just had the tournaments slightly mixed up. That's why I have notes, because you can trust the notes, not your brain. Yes, so TI6 had the Dagon meta because teams had gotten really, really good at farming, really efficient at farming, so there was just not really much you could spend your money on, and so people started just playing Mirana and Dagoning people, which was really funny. Anyway, TI6 I think is also noteworthy because it kind of reinvented production. So what I mean with that is that before this point, TI had really good production. Like, it was excellent. Nothing to complain about. But at TI6, we started seeing stuff like the VR models of the heroes like imposed onto the stream, which were really cool and something that was quite unique at the time. You had really great hosts. You had great emphasis put on making sure that there's always something fun happening on the stream. It was just great. Really, 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 really good. So the International 6 kind of pushed the standards of what a TI production could look like quite a bit upwards. That brings us to the International 8. Of course, the tournament won by the People's Champs, OG. So up to this point in TI history, every single tournament had a changing victor between China and the West. But the first was won by the West, and the second by China, then the West, then China, West, and China, and so on. And OG made their way into the finals, and it was not a smooth run. They struggled their way to the finals, winning some matches that they frankly had no business winning. But they did, and I don't mean to take away from that. Sometimes you just win games that you shouldn't win, right? And that's sick. That's cool. So OG made their way to the finals, and there they went up against the Chinese team. I believe it was LGD. And in the finals, they then broke the prophecy. They managed to actually win. And that was incredible because OG were also a team that just like had so much history. OG had been incredibly good in the previous years and then always fell short at TI. Somehow they could never make TI work for them. And then going into TI8, they just didn't even have a good season. They didn't even have a team ready. So they just grabbed Thompson off of matchmaking. It's just like, fuck it, we'll just take this random pub grinder. They just assembled this kind of, quickly tossed together team. And the miracle happened. An absolutely unbelievable miracle happened. Another thing that I think is great about TI8 is how at this point in time, it really felt like everybody was just loving Dota, which is a minor weird thing to include in a list like this, but I feel like you can feel this energy when you watch this broadcast of just everybody being super down with Dota and super excited about Dota. It's weird. When I watch modern broadcasts of Dota, it feels like there's a certain routine that has settled. And of course, that's going to happen, especially with Dota where, the staff is always the same. I don't mean to be disrespectful here, but I just kind of like, it's a thing, right? So you always have the same talent in Dota. And so I feel like, sometimes the energy isn't quite there. It just feels a bit like a paycheck. But right here, during this era, man, everybody was just super excited about it. The meta was excellent as well, with lots of heroes viable, lots of different game plans viable. But I want to talk about that a little bit more later, because this tournament was mostly a slightly worse version of a different tournament, which we're going to talk about in a moment. This brings us to the International 9. If I had to rank the International 8 and 9, I am ranking them, I guess. But ideally, I would like to rank them on the same level, right? 8 and 9, I think they're both absolutely incredible. I think TI 9 slightly edges it out for me here, though, and we're not doing same rankings. We actually got to rank them all. So TI 9 slightly edges it out for me simply because... well, Carry IO. Fucking love Carry IO. Carry IO is just exciting. But TI9 had OG just being absolute giga chats. Where in the previous year, it felt like they, only barely won. And this year, nobody else even got a chance to play. That is except for Team Liquid, who had an incredible run through the lower bracket and then made it to the finals and actually put up a good fight, and which culminated in one of the most exciting finals games, which is game 4, I believe, of the grand finals, with the disruptor, with the diffuser, not disruptor, gyrocopter with the diffuser blade, and the Carry IO coming online at the last second to defend against the bristleback push. So very exciting stuff there. Carry IO is just something that is forever stuck in my brain as one of the coolest strategies ever dreamt up. And as a result, TI9 slightly edges out the victory over TI8 to me. Still, great balance, great production. All of the things I talked about with the previous tournament that were good, were also good here. But none of these two are better to me than my personal favorite, the best international of all time, probably my favorite esports event of all time, the International 7. So, where do I even begin with the International 7? The International 7 was the first international after 7.0. Dota 7.0 is, of course, another one of those big game-shaking patches. 6.82 was one, 7.0 was the next, 7.33 eventually became another. 7.0 is a patch that introduced talents, it introduced the backpack, it introduced Monkey King, it introduced a whole host of new things. And usually after a giant patch like that, Dota is in a bit of a bad balance state. And that's not just unique to Dota, that's true for all games. Every time a game releases a giant patch that really throws things for a loop, the balance is thrown for a loop, right? That makes sense. And that was true for 7.0 as well. But Valve, in some sort of miracle freak accident, managed to actually balance Dota in a half year since 7.0, getting ready for TI7. And TI7 is numerically, statistically speaking, the most balanced of all internationals. So there was the widest hero pool variety with the most hero pool diversity. It is just objectively the most balanced of the internationals. But it also had an additional feature to it that I think doesn't get addressed often enough, and that's because people aren't quite aware of it, I think. And that's because at the International 7, the game was not only balanced from a hero perspective, but it was balanced from a game plan perspective. There were so many different approaches to playing Dota that just kind of worked really, really, really well in terms of having unique and distinct styles, unique and distinct strategies. So, of course, the standard strategy today is 1-2, 2-1-2, 2-1-2, right? 1 in the mid, 3 cores, and so on. You get it. Back then, during this era, that wasn't clear. You had tri-lane strategies that still existed, so 1-1-3. You would have dual lanes mid, 1-2-2. You would have junglers sometimes, and junglers could combine with any other setup. So it could be a 2-1-1 jungle setup, or it could be a 1-2-1 jungle setup. You would even sometimes have jungle supports still. You would have roaming supports. Heroes like Bounty Hunter or Earth Spirit would just kind of like go around the map constantly fighting, which was a distinctly different style from a jungle support. So there were so many different strategies, so many different approaches to playing the game that were just fundamentally different from each other. That weren't just, like picking a new hero, but actually picking a different game plan that made this tournament incredibly, incredibly diverse even past the hero picks. I think this tournament has the most balanced meta, even setting aside the hero picks. Like the hero picks, literally, it could be the least balanced meta in terms of hero picks, and I still would consider this the most balanced TI, which is a weird statement, but it's really something you have to see in action because you aren't used to it from a modern perspective, I think. Of course, this is also during the golden age of Dota, and very much so, because it's around this is 2017, but Dota was the most popular it ever was during 2016, and during 2017 there was still a huge amount of excitement, and the game just felt so unbelievably special. Bit of a bias, but this tournament was hosted by Day9, which I think is cool, and I like Day9. I hope this is the one. Anyways, and then, of course, that brings us to our tournament victor, which is Team Liquid. Team Liquid, we're not the best team in the world at the International 7. At least not at the beginning. They made their way to the main bracket, dropped to the lower bracket pretty early on, and then just fought their way through it. And as they were going through the tournament, you could clearly see them getting better and better and better. Team Liquid may not have started as the best team in the world, but they sure finished as it. And that was incredible. And it was just so much hype to cheering on Team Liquid through fighting through the entire lower bracket like that. An unbelievable run, making it to the grand finals. A run that I think is so incredible that it actually like slightly diminishes all other runs that were done like this. I know Team Spirit had a very similar run during their first TI win. So, it feels a little bit sad to say that this one is better, but this one is just fucking better. And that's really in big part because this tournament was so unbelievably competitive. There were so many teams that could win it, and there was no clear favorite. There was just not a single team you would look at and say, this is the one that's going to take it. It was an open field, in part because I guess team Wings weren't playing. Wings had disbanded. So the previous TI champions weren't competing for the first time. It was a perfect storm. Honestly, it was a perfect storm during the perfect time with the perfect teams and the perfect meta with brilliant production. And it's just an absolute delight. I could watch TI7 on loop and I would never get bored. This is the best one. This is the best one. And, I'm not going to say it's not even close. It is maybe close. 8 and 9 are also absolutely excellent. But yeah, TI7, that's my pick. That's the best one. I like TI7. Anyways, here I have for you a tier list. It's beautiful, I know. So at the very bottom, starting in B tier, we're not starting all the way at like a lower tier. We're starting in B tier because everything here is good, right? I've got 1, then we go to 10 and 11, then 3, 13 and 4, then 12, 2, 5 and 6, then 8 and 9, and at the very top is 7, which is my personal favorite, and I stand by that. I know that some of the other picks may be controversial. I will probably be violently insulted for ranking the International 4 above the International 3. But I can only tell you to go watch a game other than the finals, and I think you will agree with me. But yes, anyways. So that is my ranking of all the internationals. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you guys have wonderful holidays. If you did enjoy the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And yes, this right here is a bit of a bonus video that I wasn't originally planning on making in my schedule, but I thought I have some time today and I have an empty slot for a video because I haven't been uploading on Wednesdays. So let's just fucking do it. All right. I'll see you guys around. Goodbye.